calienta mi corazón. Y ese fuego que se marcha calienta mi corazón. Hoy voy a salir a ver qué pasa. Quiero ir a un lugar donde no entienda lo que pasa. Me pongo los guantes, no llevo papeles, la cosa me dice que esto va a
Hi, and welcome to this week's Cañete'S the Film, which is my allegedly weekly YouTube podcast on art criticism. And this week I'm going to review in depth a show that is taking place at the Guggenheim Museum called Under the Sun, Latinamerican Art Today. It's, as the title suggests, a survey on what's going on in Latin American art, involving 15 countries, 40 artists, and curated by a Mexican curator, Pablo Leon de la Barra. The show is structured on 5 topics: conceptualism, tropicalism, political activism, modernism and its failures, and participation/emancipation. Under the Same Sun is part of the Guggenheim UBS MAP Global Art Initiative that is a purchase fund. Basically all the works that are going to be included in this show are purchased with money, UBS money, and will be part of the permanent collection of the Guggenheim Museum. In this exhibition, art is circumscribed to the mere illustration of an idea of the world as a place where diversity does not bring conflict but creates the fiction that globalization is by definition democratic, fair, open-minded, and even joyful. To achieve this, UBS needs to hire a willing native informant ready to transform an already complex notion, like Latin America, into a series of updated clichés which for that purpose are announced as the opposite of that, with phrases such as Latin America is more than bananas and Carmen Miranda. But let's see how its curator Pablo Leon de la Barra presents his own show.
My interest is in Latin American art and in Latin American art in dialogue. There's an interesting thing that many of the countries in Latin America, although they share a common history, a common colonial history, and a common recent history, history of dictatorships, economic crisis, social uprisings, still they haven't been that much in contact. So I guess the importance of a project at the Global Art Initiative is that it's really going into deep into these different contexts and researching them, and recognizing that we can create networks of knowledge which recognize the existing differences, the particularities, and that we can learn from these different knowledge, ways of solving problems, of confronting realities, of confronting crises, and ways of creating also new worlds and better worlds. In these terms, the Global Art Initiative puts everything at the same level and creates or attempts to create these connections. My background comes first from architecture and then from art. I've been curating at least for the past 10 years. I love exhibition making, and I really think exhibition making for me is a way of doing research on topics, not only topics that interest me, but I think topics that are relevant for a particular context or for society itself. For example, one called This Is Not America in San Juan, Puerto Rico, which played with the double idea that Puerto Rico is a free associated state of the United States, which is and is not America. There's a great work by Alfredo Jar from the 80s, which he presented in Times Square, and it was a big video saying, this is not America, America is also the whole of the continent, which I think continues to be as relevant in terms of expanding these geographies and creating new cartographies and redrawing the borders of map. Funnily enough, the United States has now become Latin America, with 1/4 of the population becoming almost 1/3 soon, being from Latin American origin. So I think we cannot continue talking of Latin America as we used to before. You know, I think Latin America is the continent. Other exhibitions have had a playful element which incorporates humor also as a way of dealing with reality. For example, Bananas is my business, the South American way, which happened at the Museo Carmen Miranda, which I co-curated with Julieta Gonzalez, where on one hand we worked with the archive of the museum, Carmen Miranda's papers, records, clothing, but we used it as a way to rethink South American stereotypes, you know, going beyond the image that Carmen Miranda had of being this kind of woman with bananas in her hair. You know? Very recently I made an exhibition in London at the David Roberts Art Foundation, one called Friends of London, artists from Latin America in London from 1960X to 1970X, which explored many of these untold histories of artists who I call heroes or pioneers, who were in exile, many because of the dictatorships in their own country, and which do not form part of the official art histories, and nevertheless contributed to the art scene of the time, and created works that in a way connected what they were before, what they were while being in Latin America, with the avant-gardes with whom they were in contact at the time. Or Juan Downey, who was a great video pioneer, who traveled the Americas doing this project called Video Trans-Americas, where he would tape the different communities who he encountered. And then in the main square of the city, he would show in the TVs the videos that he made of the previous city. So in a way, he was doing something similar to what we are trying to do now, you know, creating this kind of connections between different regions and giving visibility to each other. And here at Guggenheim, we also have our own history of our relationship with Latin America. There's works from the 40s, 50s, from Tamayo to Lucio Fontana. We have Mata, Roberto Mata. There's works from the 70s, 80s. We have Ana Mendieta in the collection. But much more interestingly, there was a 1966 exhibition, which was curated by the then director, Thomas Esser, where he traveled through Latin America in 1965, very similar to what we're doing now, where he identified who were the major artists and players of the bigger countries of Latin America at the time. So he traveled through Mexico, Colombia, Peru, Brazil, Argentina, Chile, and brought back the best of the painting that was happening at the time. He was very interested in abstract painting. It's a pity that he didn't travel maybe 2 years later, because I think the panorama would have been totally another. The seeds of change were already happening when he visited, but they were still not strong enough. But let's think Oiticica. Elio Oiticica had already in '65 presented the Parapoles, the exhibition at the Museum of Art Moderno in Rio, already from '65, but towards '68, big changes on what they called the dematerialization of art in Argentina were happening at the time. So Thomas Messer visited in this time before this change happened, I mean everywhere in the world. We're talking about '68. The catalog is fascinating because it has photos by Cornel Capra of not only studio visits, but also how the artists lived and worked, artists with their family, artists going to the bar, to the pub. So really trying also to show artists living in these foreign lands as also being very, or having a normal life. You know? Thomas Esser's The Emerging Decade will have an influence in the research we do. I don't think in terms of aesthetics of following the same line of research, but yes, in his interest in relating with Latin America. And what was also really interesting is that he was not only in contact with the main artists of the time, but also with the main critical thinkers. So in Colombia, there's letters that he wrote and responses that he got from Marta Traba. In Mexico with Matthias Geritz, and it continues in the whole of the continent. So I think it's a really interesting way of someone that was interested in expanding this dialogue and also in creating this kind of network of art production that was happening at the time. So I think it will be a fascinating journey. And in terms of what concerns us, which is art and artists and exhibitions and curating, I think we will be as democratic as possible in terms of not only going to the major countries, but also trying to, one, create connections between them, but also going to those countries which are less seen in terms of what's happening in these places, and in giving them visibility, and again, in creating connections between them.
To begin with, the show's title, Under the Sun, Latin America Today, Latin American Art Today, is misleading because the show is hardly about Latin American art per se, but about the art produced by a group of people who were born in Latin America, but who have been educated so as to emigrate and find a new life in Europe and the US. They are young and ambitious. They have been taught in art schools in Europe and the US the jargon with which post-minimalist and conceptual fine arts students tend to justify their work. So they speak fluently and not always convincingly with words like practices, dialogues, choices, curating, etc., etc. Of course, they all speak fluent English and respond to the ways of the international art market. In general, their practice puts more emphasis in the concept and its justification than in the actual production of the work. There also seems to be a difference between what it is said about the works and the works themselves, and it is that difference that I want to explore. Let me be more clear. After listening to the curator and some of the artists, Latin America is presented as a joyful, improvised, and playful place. However, when we look at the works included in this show, what we see is a problematization of the needs of self-fashioning of those middle-class boys and girls who self-fashioned in a way to make themselves accepted, mainly in the US and Europe. They chose some rhetorical distinctiveness, but it is delivered in the international language of art as business, contemporary art. So I would say that as a survey of Latin American art, this show is flawed for four main reasons. Firstly, as said before, the overwhelming majority of the artists do not live and have not lived in Latin America for a long time. This opens a series of considerations of whether Latin American art is the art produced in Latin America or the art that uses Latin America as an added value to say the same things that the art from New York and London is saying. This brings us to the next question. That has to do with the genealogy of some of the concepts that the curator ubiquitously deploys. In other words, where he got those concepts from. And surprisingly, we will see that notions like tropicalization are notions that, according to Pablo Leon de la Barra's own words, derived from Swiss artist Matthias Goeritz, who worked in Mexico, and French artist Dominique González Foerster, who worked in Brazil. This means that the artists that allowed the curator to come up with a conceptual framework that we could use to approach today's Latin American art are just not Latin American. I guess that the problem lies in the way the art of these, how to put it, high-skilled migrant workers, or, in other words, migrant workers with great expectations, speak of its makers' problems. I'm saying this because when Pablo Leon de la Barra refers to the tropical in reference to the work of Mariana Castillo de Val, he does not talk about culture, but about high-skilled migrant workers. About the fact that Castillo de Val has been living in Berlin for more than a decade, he actually uses an inflection of his voice. And how the British Museum protected Mexico's own heritage, which allegedly, we are meant to suppose, they are not or they have not been able to protect themselves. But de la Barra not only limits himself to showcase Latin American artists that do not live in Latin America, but he also considers that advantageous. For, in his own words, by being far away, that is, in Europe or the US, they get the distance that allows them to question their own culture. So is this show about Latin American art today, or about Latin American artists living in the first world who question their own culture? And if so, for which reasons? Why? Secondly, and as a consequence of this, the conceptual weight of the show, and I would say Pablo Leon de la Barra's whole career as a curator, lies on the notion of tropicalism. However, in his introduction to the UBS show, that we just see, so he avoids giving a definition of what he understands by it. So, to understand what he means, we need to go to an essay written by him for a catalogue of contemporary Brazilian art edited by Hossein Amis Sadehi and London collector Catherine Pettigas. The article's title is Notes from the Tropics, where Pablo Leon de la Barra says, and I'm quoting Pablo Leon de la Barra, "To be tropical is not a question of nationality or location. It is a question of attitude and resistance. Artistic production, both inside and outside of Brazil, has recently reclaimed the concept of the tropical to define a sensibility that originates between the tropics and which differs from a European and North American one. The use of the tropical as an aesthetic category avoids the traps and clichés of national and regional cultural representations. And he continues, Elio Otishica in 1968 was warning against simplification and superficial reading of the tropical. In words of Otishica, and now we're quoting Otishica, as can be seen, the myth of tropicality is much more than parrots and banana trees. It is the consciousness of being conditioned by established structures, hence highly revolutionary in its entirety. Any conformity, be it intellectual, social, or existential, is contrary to its principal idea. This is the end of Elio Otishica's quote. And now we continue with De la Barra, who tells us how at the opening night of the Opinion 65 exhibition at MAM at the Museum of Modern Art in Rio in 1965, Otishica and his friends from the Mangueira Samba School entered the museum, which until then had been a sanctuary of the Carioca elite and high art, wearing parangolés, colored capes and banners he had developed with the inhabitants of the Morro of Mangueira. By means of this artistic political act, those normally excluded from the institution took over it. Soon afterwards, Otishica developed a series of environments he called penetraves. This included Tropicalia, 1967, and Eden, 1969. For this, I created a tropical scenario, as it were, with plants, parrots, sand, pebbles, he explained. It seemed to me, while walking about the environs and set of Tropicalia, that I was going through the gullies and over the curves of the Morro, which were organic, like the fantastic architecture of the slums, another life experience, says Otishica. So, De la Barra concludes that Otishica collapsed the relationship between exhibitions, art objects, and everyday objects, transforming the space into an experiential one. His major contribution to art was in the transformation of the spectator from passive viewer into active participant. So far so good, until now. But in that essay, De la Barra decides all of a sudden to link Elio Otishica's tropicalism with French artist Dominique Gonzalez Forster's notion of tropicalization. And it is in this link that I believe a translation is attempted. A translation from the original subversive Brazilian tropicalia of the notion of tropicality into a more touristy and sanitized romanticization of the tropics in the concept that the French artist Dominique Gonzalez Forster understands as tropicalism. It is, I believe, Pablo Leon de la Barra's greatest confusion, for he injects this mistake to everything he has curated since then. In a way, Dominique Gonzalez Forster mixes the kind of exploration of space that we see in Latin American artists abroad, such as Ernesto Neto, Gabriel Orozco, and Carlos Garaycoa, who belonged to the 1955-1975 generation, with Elio Otishica's experimental approach. So I believe the key to understand De la Barra's obsession with participative art, the art that you can move with your own hands, that you can penetrate, etc., must be traced to Dominique Gonzalez Forster, who, in spite of the fact that is included by him in a book of Brazilian art, is not Brazilian, but French, and has known Brazil mainly as a visitor and from a very specific social perspective. She traveled to Brazil for the first time in 1998. De la Barra says that that trip to Brasilia and Rio would expose her to a modernity different from the European modernities in which she had grown up, and would have such an impact on the artist that her work and life would be utterly transformed. From being a tourist, she became a traveler and then a part-time resident. So the part-time resident seems to be who is telling us the way Latin American art should be experienced. According to De la Barra in her work, and I'm quoting De la Barra, Brazil became not only a plan for escape, but a window for rereading the world. Basically, Brazil, and this is me, basically Brazil was a place where took place the middle life crisis of this upper middle class French woman, and the outcome of that process is the conceptual framework that the UBS is using to organize the experience of Latin American art at the Guggenheim. It is through this tropical modernité, as Dominique Gonzalez Forster calls it, that according to De la Barra, she decided to be less rational and more emotional. She just decided to be more in touch with her own body. In Dominic Gonzalez Forster's words, and we're quoting her, certain moments of Brasilia or Hong Kong, and I'm talking about moments, not only places, a combination of people, buildings, light, sound, plants, events that seem to display city size, a very inner state of things, what I sometimes call emotional traffic or emotional black market. The way we negotiate internally to keep desire and beauty alive against all forms of control of authority. Tropical conditions, she says, seem able to reveal the beautiful, the immature mess that generates modernity. The powerful and conscious side of modernity seems to need a special light and context to be more active. Then Pablo Leon de la Barra goes on to describe many of her works, of which I randomly chose two. The first one is called Plage, beaches. As you can see, the title is not in Spanish or Portuguese, but in French, and it's specifically translated into English, and shows a huge crowd dressed in white, which is walking along the beach during 15 minutes of Copacabana. The camera is set in front of the Autumn Palace Hotel in Copacabana, and it follows the movements of the waves of the people and the curves of Roberto Burle Marx's pavement design. Wavy pavement designs. It is night and there are stalls, bonfires. It almost seems like carnival. 4 different voices recall memories of Rio and Copacabana. One sings, another remembers Burle Marx, of course. Another remembers a first sexual encounter, and finally, one describes utopian projects for Rio. The sound of an ambulance can be heard. Fireworks. It is New Year's Eve. I guess the point of these are the waves and the mix. The conflation of memories, one wants to believe, and chance, which is opposed to the European overscheduled and systematic lifestyle, the boredom of the North against the playfulness and joy of the South, I guess. What in Elliot Ishika's Tropicalia in the 60s meant real participation of the lower class in the way the Museum of Modern Art was taken over by the inhabitants of the Morro, in Dominique Gonzalez Forster's is sanitized as and aestheticized into playful urban intervention. In her work titled Marquise, inside a pavilion designed in Sao Paulo by Oscar Niemeyer, the artist repeated the cylindrical white columns that support both the building and the walkway, an almost invisible intervention in which, as if by some sort of tropical effect, and this is a quote, the columns had multiplied and grouped themselves in families. So the columns were gathered as forming a forest, as we are seeing now in the images. One of the columns has invisible wheels and can move from place to place. People and skaters who use the space continued using it as if nothing has changed, as if the effect of multiplication of columns were a normal one given the climate. So here we can see how the playful, the not functional, the joyful, which in themselves are part of the cliché of the Latin American that Carmen Miranda used to represent, comes back with vengeance and is reinforced, but not from inside Latin America, but surprisingly from the imposition from outside of a sanitized conceptual and post-minimalist European point of view. What Dominique Gonzalez Forster does is to empty topicality from its subversive content and commodifies it as an updated cliché. There is, however, a subtle movement towards the idea of traveling as therapy, even rehab from the boredom of Europe. So this allows us to think that Dominique Gonzalez Forster's art is the updated myth of the exotic, which instead of the jungle passes to the modernist, as she would call them, plush. I think that de la Barra's notion of tropicalism wrongly jumps from Elliot Ishika to Dominique Gonzalez Forster, only to collapse into the curatorial principles of Hans Ulrich Obricht, who Leon de la Barra tries to emulate, according to whom exhibitions should encourage the participation of the visitor to the point of having made artists write a series of instructions for the public to follow at home in order to organize their own DIY exhibitions. In other words, the quest for more participation ends up with the total privatization of art. It is in the passage between Elio Otishika's tropicality to Gonzalez Forster's tropicalism that Pablo Leon de la Barra mistakes the visitor's experience in the tropics with Latin American art. So basically, the UBS and Pablo Leon de la Barra reduced the participation, subversive participation of the Brazilian Tropicalia to the Guggenheim's visitor experience, and he puts them on the same level. Of course, all these art objects, as we can see, can be made at the lowest cost, both in terms of time and materials. So everything becomes about choices, about playing around, about fooling around, and everything becomes childish. So what originally was, if you want, a socialist experience or a progressive experience, now becomes a childish.
And the artist's choices within their practices, and I would have to choose myself some artworks in the exhibition to talk about today. So I felt like I was curating inside the curator. I prefer today to talk about choices in the middle of the scenario that we have now, like that the information is all shared, that we are here in New York talking about South America that is not far or close. Okay, for this one I chose a sculpture to start with. So if I chose fruits here as something known, here the known bit is a sculpture. There is the Venus of Willendorf. There is that prehistorical Venus that even if you're not a very good art history student, as I was not, you remember those because you always have to start either with Egypt or prehistory. And so everybody's got in mind that I think she's small, and there are many of her. But this would be a Venus upside down. So this would be the head and the body, and the feet would be here. So you can picture that. And this is the Venus finally standing by herself without any pedestal or support or anything, because she's doing like we could say that this would be a yogi standing pose on top of the head. And yeah, so it's a sculpture of a sculpture. Here there are fruits, but after working with fruits for a while, here I felt like, oh, I need giant fruits for this composition, but there are no giant fruits, so we were translating the fruit textures into something that is made with the hands, like these are all fingers, and would create my own invented nature for this purpose of having fruits big enough to make that composition. So those will be clay balls that used for gardening, and everything was made in clay. And there is this cut here that is probably just a demonstration of how arbitrary a sculpture can be. Like I was following these rules, but all of a sudden I could cut it for the sake of elegance or of having this flat surface here in the bronze that's very nice to look at. And even if you're not invited to touch the sculpture in the museum, I hope that people get a very tactile feel. I didn't touch it now, and I feel like I did, because you have all these marks, and you can imagine that these grooves were forced into the material, and so it's a very tactile experience to be shared with. Also, very body. It has a body that interacts with the viewer almost in a human scale. We can move now to Federico's painting. There's Across the Road, please. It says in the label of the painting that we don't have much painting because painting was kind of denied by Latin America, as people would choose, and again we're talking about choice, conceptual art for their purposes. Before seeing that there were not many paintings in the show, I saw a picture of Federico standing next to the painting, and I was very happy to see this, because it's first thing that is very easy to tell that it's the Brazilian landscape, but he's not Brazilian, so he's already And so this is the sugar loaf, pão de açúcar landscape, and it's also very sculptural. So it's very natural that I would be attracted to it. It has like this body presence in the middle of the canvas, but what he's offering us is just his gesture. Like there is this painterly, like this is drier here, that it changes everything. The fact that this is not like a clean line like the rest. And then there is this funny mark here. There's a mystery about that. It's not conceptual really. It's not that he thought, I'm going to make 3 stripes and 1 geometric-ish mountain in the middle. Things were happening and he was paying attention, and this probably happened and he likes it. So his experience in this painting and his gesture and the simplicity, he was very, I would dare to say, lucky to end up with. He says that the painting captures the soul of the mountain. And this sounds, like a very romantic view of, is he trying to capture the soul of nature? But I quite enjoy that. He's saying that's the soul of the mountain, because when you say soul, you immediately connect it to religion, and there's some faith involved. So the feeling of faith meets this thing that I want to believe in. He believes in art, and in painting, and in the art object, and in art making. So there is something between the soul and that connected me to the idea of faith, and I was very happy to find that. This is the last one I picked. This is Adriano Costa. He's an artist from São Paulo. That's the same hometown as myself. I know his work since he started a couple years ago, and I've been following it. It's easy for me to like it because it presents the art object maybe in a similar way to mine. There's so much happening with these textures, and the fact that they are found objects, that they are like bath mats, it couldn't be more domestic and mundane again, coming from the tortillas. And there is something that we have for me here. This one is an opportunity to be mindful and aware. There is something that I'm really looking for these days, not only in art but in life. There is having the chance to pay attention to what's going on in the present, and so I guess this work keeps us in the present moment for a while. When you see these bits on the edges that are falling apart, and there are some figures, you can see 2 small feet there. They're really something in the middle of composition, and there is some wrinkling there, and this is possible because of this very simple gesture that he's offering, the painted everything gold. And for me, what the gold paint does beforehand gives me the opportunity to pay attention to all of them at the same level, and then to these differences and these details.
Pablo Leon de la Barra speaking for the first time at a conference on Mexican architect Carlos Barragán. I was appalled by how little he understood the true Baroque complexity of Latin American art. For him, art objects are something closer to fashion items than anything else. That's why I think he likes but does not truly understand Elio Otexeika's belief that tropicalist Latin America is an attitude or a state of mind. Emptying it from its Marxist meaning, that sentence is a fashion statement, and that is the way Pablo Leon de la Barra and the artists he chose seem to use it. However, there's something that at first sight might seem irrelevant, even outrageous, but after this discussion I hope it brings more critical light to the issue of curators of Latin American art as native informants of the need to use international art as a tool for a paradoxical conflation of difference and uniformity in a globalized world. And it's the fact that as a Latin American and as a client of UBS, I was surprised to see that Pablo Leon de la Barra had participated in a porn photoshoot for Gay Butt magazine. Coming from him, it does not surprise me because he's constantly constructing identity by erasing the boundaries between the curator and the artist understood as outrageous. I think that was part of a career strategy, to be honest. Having said this, I cannot but express shock at the fact that a bank like UBS did not bother to Google the background of someone who, as I showed in this, The Pill, is not prepared enough or intelligent enough for curating such a show. Unless that porn side is the other side of that same coin that we called during this discussion the updated cliché of Latin America as a woman with bananas on the head. In this case, the man seemed to have the banana in the mouth, and also the sponsorship of UBS and the Guggenheim. He must be doing something right, at least for someone in the north. A lot to think about. Until next time.
Parece un baldío donde nunca los vi. Sentaron porque vieron el frío dormido. Una caja ciega nace de ese hueco. Veo los salvajes